For 400 years, the history books have told you a lie. They told you that the lost colonists of Roanoke simply vanished. They told you they wandered off into the woods, victims of starvation or weather, or the madness of the New World. You were taught that they were lost. But you cannot lose an entire city. You cannot lose 115 souls, including a newborn babe, without a single scream, without a single drop of blood, without a single broken blade of grass. The truth is much colder, and it is hidden in the archives of the British Empire, beneath layers of wax seals and censored maps. The settlers of Roanoke did not disappear. They were erased. They were cleaned away by a force so efficient, so precise, that when the ships finally returned, they found not a tragedy, but a void, a perfect, terrifying emptiness. The houses were taken down, not burned. The bodies were gone, not buried. It was a crime scene that had been scrubbed by the hands of the state. What happened on that island in 1590 wasn't a mystery. It was a quarantine. And the reason the Queen of England burned the maps wasn't to hide where they went. It was to hide what they had found. This is the truth the king buried. Now. Let the noise of the modern world fade away. Let the screen before you dim. We are going to travel back, far back, to a time of wood and sail, of salt and silence. Take a deep breath. Inhale the scent of old parchment, of drying ink, of the heavy, salty air of the Atlantic Ocean. We are drifting back to the year 1590. The world is vast, dangerous, and largely unknown. The maps have blank spaces where monsters are said to dwell. And we are standing on the deck of a ship, rocking gently on the gray swells of the sea, staring at a coastline that looks like a dark green bruise against the horizon. This is the story of the silence that deafened the world. Let us walk the sand of Roanoke. The date is August the 18th, 1590. It is the height of summer, but the air feels cold. You are seeing this through the eyes of Governor John White. He is a man exhausted by the sea, a man whose beard is matted with salt, whose hands are calloused from gripping the rail of the ship named the Hopewell. He has been gone for 3 years, 3 long, agonizing years. He left his daughter, Eleanor, and his granddaughter, Virginia, the first English child born in this new world on this island. He went back to England for supplies, promising to return before the seasons changed, but war came. The Spanish Armada filled the ocean with fire and cannon smoke. The Queen locked down the ports, and John White was trapped in London, looking across the water, knowing his family was waiting. Waiting for food, waiting for help, waiting for him. Now, finally, the waiting is over. The longboat cuts through the water. The sound is rhythmic. Splash, creak, creak. The oars dip into the dark water, pulling the men toward the shore. John White sits in the bow of the boat. His heart is hammering against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the quiet afternoon. He scans the tree line. He is looking for a signal. Before he left, 3 years ago, he gave the settlers a specific instruction. He told them, if you must leave, if you are forced out by hunger or by enemies, carve a cross into the tree. Carve a cross, so I know you were in distress. He looks at the trees. The pine trees, tall and ancient, sway gently in the wind. There is no smoke rising above the canopy. That is the first thing that chills his blood. A settlement of 100 people requires fire. Fire for cooking, fire for warmth, fire for forging tools, but the sky is clear. The air is clean. There is no smell of wood smoke. There's only the smell of pine resin and the rotting kelp on the beach. The boat scrapes against the sand. The sound is harsh, loud in the stillness. White jumps into the surf. The water is warm, swirling around his boots. He stumbles up the beach, his eyes wide, his breath catching in his throat. "Hello?" He calls out, his voice is swallowed by the vastness of the American wilderness. "Eleanor?" Nothing comes back but the cry of a seagull circling high above. A lonely, mocking sound. The men behind him, the sailors and soldiers, are quiet. They sense it too. Sailors are superstitious men. They know the feeling of a place that is wrong. And this beach feels ... empty, not just uninhabited, but emptied. They walk up the dunes, their boots sinking into the soft sand. They crest the hill, and there, spread out before them, is the place where the city of Raleigh should be. It is gone. Let us visualize the scene with forensic detail. When you imagine a lost colony, perhaps you imagine a scene of chaos. Houses burned to ash. Skeletons scattered in the dirt. Weapons dropped in panic. A meal left half-eaten on a table, covered in dust. But that is not what John White found. And that is why this story keeps historians awake at night. He walked into the clearing where the houses once stood. And he found ... order. The houses had not been burned. They had been dismantled. Carefully, deliberately. Imagine the labor required to do that. These were sturdy homes, built of heavy timber, thatched with reeds. They were built to withstand hurricanes. And yet they were taken down, piece by piece. The wood was not scattered. It was gone, removed. It was as if the settlement had simply been erased from the map. White walked to the center of the village. He looked at the ground. He was looking for signs of a struggle. If the Spanish had come, the great enemy of England, they would have burned the village to send a message. If the local tribes had attacked, there would be arrows, broken spears, the signs of a desperate last stand, but the earth was undisturbed. Grass had begun to grow back in the patches where the floors used to be. It was quiet, so incredibly quiet. The wind whispered through the branches of the live oaks, rattling the dry leaves. White signaled his men to spread out. "Find them," he whispered. "Find anything." He himself walked toward the perimeter. The settlers had built a palisade, a high wall of wooden stakes, to protect themselves. The wall was still standing. This was the first anomaly. If you are leaving a place forever, you do not repair the fence. If you are fleeing for your life, you do not check the perimeter, but the palisade was strong. It stood like a monument to a people who were no longer there. White ran his hand over the rough wood of the stakes. They were weathered by 3 years of salt air, gray and hard as iron. He reached the entrance of the fort. And there he stopped. His heart stopped. On one of the gateposts, the bark had been peeled away. A smooth, rectangular patch of light wood shone in the dim forest light. Someone had taken a knife. Someone had stood here, perhaps only days ago, perhaps years ago, and carved a message. White leaned in, his eyes straining in the gloom. One word. Capital letters. Deep, deliberate cuts. Croatoan. He stared at the word. He traced the letters with his trembling fingers. Croatoan. It was the name of a nearby island. It was the name of a friendly tribe, but there was no cross. He checked the wood frantically, looking above the word below it. He looked for the sign of distress he had agreed upon, the cross that would mean, "We are being hunted. We are dying. Save us." There was no cross. The letters were neat. They were not carved by a shaking hand. They were not carved in the dark, in the rain, in the panic of an attack. They were carved with the precision of a tombstone engraver. What did it mean? If they had moved to Croatoan Island willingly, why take the houses? Why leave no detailed letter? Why leave the heavy cannons? Yes, the cannons. White turned and looked at the defensive positions. The small cannons, the falcons and minions were still there, but they were overturned. They were lying in the dirt, covered in rust and moss. This was the detail that made no sense. If the settlers had moved peacefully, they would have taken the guns. The guns were their life. The guns were their only protection against the Spanish Empire. You do not leave your weapons behind unless you are dead, or unless you have found something so powerful that guns no longer matter. Unless the person who removed you did not want you to fight back. White walked further into the ghost village. He remembered a spot, a secret spot, where he had buried his own chests before he left. He had buried his journals, his maps, his drawings of the flora and fauna of this new world. He had hidden them to keep them safe from the damp and the rain. He fell to his knees at the spot. The earth had been dug up. His chest lay open to the sky. It was a violation. The wood of the chest was rotten, splintered by the rain. But it was the contents that chilled him. His books were torn from their covers. His maps were soaked and ruined. His armor, his personal breastplate, was there, red with rust, corroded by the salt air. But they weren't stolen. The local tribes valued metal above all else. Iron was more precious than gold to them. If the village had been raided by natives, the metal armor would be the first thing taken. It would be a trophy of immense power, but there it lay. A rusted shell of a man lying in the mud. It had been dug up, inspected, and discarded. Why? What kind of intruder digs up a treasure chest, looks at the weapons and the armor, and decides they are not worth taking? It suggests an intruder who already has better weapons, or an intruder who is looking for something specific, something that was not in the chest. White stood up, wiping the mud from his hands. He felt a gaze on him. He spun around. Who is there? He hissed. Only the trees answered. The Spanish moss hung from the branches like gray rags. Swaying, swaying, he felt the heavy, suffocating sensation of being watched. Not by animals, not by men hiding in the bush, but by the island itself. The air felt thick, charged with a static energy that made the hair on his arms stand up. It was then that he noticed the silence again. Listen closely to the silence. In a forest, even in the afternoon, there should be sound. Squirrels chattering, birds calling, the rustle of deer in the underbrush, but Roanoke was silent. It was a vacuum. It was as if the life of the island had been sucked away along with the people. The men were gathering near the shore, looking anxious. They wanted to leave. They did not like this place. The boatswain whispered to the captain that the tide was turning, that a storm was brewing in the east. "We must go, Governor," the captain said softly. "There is nothing here, but where are they?" White whispered, his voice cracking. "Where is my granddaughter?" He looked back at the tree. At the word Croatoan, it wasn't a destination. It felt like a label, like a classification, or perhaps a warning. Night began to fall on the empty island. The shadows stretched long and thin, like fingers reaching out from the tree line to grab the men standing on the beach. John White did not want to leave. He wanted to march into the forest. He wanted to tear the island apart with his bare hands until he found a clue. But the darkness in 1590 was not like the darkness of today. There were no city lights reflecting off the clouds. When the sun went down, the world became a void. And in that void, fear took shape. The men lit a fire on the beach. They huddled around it, their backs to the ocean, their eyes fixed on the black wall of the forest. They spoke in hushed tones. They spoke of the devil, they spoke of the wild men of the woods, but deep down, they knew this wasn't the work of savages. Savages leave mess. Savages leave chaos. This was clean. This was professional, the dismantling of the houses, the burying of the evidence. The lack of bodies. It required time. It required organization. It required a plan. Who had the power to do this? Only two forces on earth possessed the discipline to erase a city so completely. One was the Spanish Empire. But if the Spanish had done it, they would have planted a flag. They would have left a cross. They would have claimed the victory for the Catholic king. They would have gloated. The other force was England itself. White stared into the fire. A terrible thought began to form in the back of his mind. A thought he dared not speak. The Queen ordered this? Had the colony found something, some resource, some object, some disease that was so dangerous, the Crown decided it could not be allowed to exist? Was the word Croatoan a code? White remembered the conversations in London before the voyage. He remembered the secret meetings with the royal astrologers, with the alchemists who advised the Queen. They were obsessed with the New World, not just for gold, but for knowledge, for the ancient secrets they believed were hidden in the lost lands of the West. Had the settlers found one of those secrets? And had they paid the ultimate price for it? The fire crackled. A log shifted, sending a shower of sparks up into the night sky. Suddenly, a sound drifted from the woods. It was faint. So faint that White thought he imagined it. It sounded like music. Not a drum, not a chant, but a high, thin piping sound, like a flute made of bone. The men froze. Hands went to sword hilts. Did you hear that? A soldier whispered. It was the wind, the captain said, but his voice was tight. It was a tune, the soldier insisted. I know a tune when I hear one. They listened. Silence returned. Heavier than before. White stood up and walked to the edge of the light. He peered into the darkness. Eleanor? He whispered again. For a second he thought he saw a shape. A pale shape standing between the trees. A figure in a dress watching him. He blinked and it was gone. Just a trick of the moonlight on the Spanish moss. But the feeling remained. The feeling that they were not alone. That the colonists were not far away. Perhaps. They were still here. Perhaps they hadn't moved at all. What if the Croatoan carving wasn't telling them where the people went? What if it was telling them what the people had become? The wind picked up. The waves crashed harder against the shore. The storm was coming. White knew he had to leave. The ship could not survive a hurricane in these shallow waters. He had to abandon the search. He had to leave his daughter and his granddaughter behind in the dark. It was the hardest decision of his life. As the longboat pushed off from the sand. Leaving the empty city behind, White looked back one last time. The moon broke through the clouds, illuminating the palisade wall, and for one terrifying moment, the empty village didn't look like a settlement. It looked like a cage built not to keep things out, but to keep something in. The boat moved into the darkness. The island faded into the mist, and the secret of Roanoke was left to rot in the silence. But the story does not end on the beach, because John White was wrong. The village wasn't empty. There was one thing left behind. One piece of evidence that the cleaners missed. Deep in the soil, beneath the roots of the message tree, Something was waiting to be found. Something that would change everything we know about human history. To find it, we must dig. To understand the disappearance of 115 people. You must first understand the death of just one, before the colony vanished, before the houses were dismantled. And before the word Croatoan was carved into the tree, there was a warning. It was a warning written not in ink and not in wood, but in bone. When the settlers first arrived in 1587, 3 years before the Great Silence, they walked onto the beach full of hope. They expected to find a garrison of 15 British soldiers guarding the island, men who had been left behind by a previous expedition to hold the fort. They expected to see flags flying. They expected to hear the sound of English greetings. Instead, they found a ghost town. The fort was overgrown with melon vines. The deer were grazing in the commander's house, and the 15 soldiers were gone, except for one. They found a single human skeleton lying face down in the tall grass. The bones were bleached white by the sun. The skull was shattered not by a bullet but by blunt force. There were no other bodies, just him, the sentinel of the dead. Why leave one? If it was a massacre, where were the others? If it was a retreat, why leave a man behind? The single skeleton wasn't a casualty of war. It was a message left by the island itself. It was a signpost that said, "You can come here, you can build your houses, but you will never leave. This is the truth the king buried. Now. Let the image of the white bone fade into the sand. Close your eyes. Let your shoulders drop. Let the tension of the day unravel like a frayed rope. We are going to turn the hourglass over. We are going to watch the sand flow upward against gravity, taking us back 3 years before John White found the empty village. We are going back to the beginning. To the moment the trap was sprung. Imagine the sound of canvas snapping in the wind. Imagine the smell of tar and rain. You are standing on the deck of the Lion, the flagship of the 1587 expedition. The year is new. The hope is fresh. The nightmare has not yet begun. Let us step onto the shore. The date is July the 22nd, 1587. It is a sweltering afternoon. The air in North Carolina is thick, almost like water. It carries the heavy, sweet scent of rotting vegetation and blooming jasmine. It is a beautiful, suffocating smell. 117 men, women, and children are disembarking from the boats. They are tired. They have spent months at sea, cramped in dark, damp holds, eating salted beef and drinking stale beer. To them, this island looks like paradise. The sand is white and clean. The trees are taller than anything they have seen in England, giant oaks and pines that seem to scrape the sky. Grapes grow wild on the vines, so thick that they spill into the ocean waves. John White, who is not yet the governor of a lost city, but simply a hopeful leader, steps onto the sand. He is smiling. He turns to the pilot of the ship, a Portuguese man named Simon Fernandez. "Take us to the fort," White says. "Take us to the 15 men. You see, this was the safety net." Sir Richard Grenville, a famous admiral, had visited this island the year before. He had left 15 sturdy soldiers behind with supplies for 2 years. He had told them, "Hold this ground for the Queen, we will return." White comforts the women. He tells his pregnant daughter Eleanor, "Do not worry. The soldiers will have the fires lit, they will have fresh water. We are not alone here." They begin the march inland. The forest is quiet. Too quiet. As they walk, the birds stop singing. The cicadas, which usually buzz with a deafening electric hum in the summer heat, fall silent as the humans approach. The group reaches the clearing where the old fort stands. The first thing they notice is the disrepair dot in England. A building left for a year might gather a little dust. In the subtropical heat of the New World, nature reclaims everything instantly. Vines the size of a man's arm have wrapped around the wooden palisades. Weeds have burst through the floorboards of the cottages. "Hello?" A soldier calls out. "God save the Queen!" Another shouts, expecting the garrison to run out and greet them. There is no answer. The wind rustles the tall grass. A shutter on one of the houses bangs against the wall. Bang, Bang, the joy drains from the faces of the settlers. The children stop playing. They move forward, pushing through the overgrowth. They enter the circle of the fort. It is then that they see it. It lay near the entrance of the commander's hut. At first, it looked like driftwood, white and jagged, partially covered by the creeping ivy. But driftwood does not have ribs. Driftwood does not have teeth. John White froze. He held up his hand to stop the others, but it was too late. Eleanor had seen it. A gasp rippled through the crowd. It was a complete human skeleton. It had not been buried. It had been left where it fell. Let us look closely at this skeleton through the eyes of the archives. The bones were clean, picked clean by the buzzards, by the ants, by the crabs that scuttle up from the beach at night. The clothing was gone, rotted away or stolen, but the violence was still etched into the calcium. The skull was the most telling. It lay slightly apart from the spine. The top of the cranium was crushed. Not a clean cut from a sword, but a chaotic, shattering fracture. It suggested a club. A heavy wooden weapon, swung with immense force. White knelt beside the bones. He looked for the others. He looked for the other 14 men. He stood up and ran to the other houses. He kicked open the doors. Is anyone there? Empty. He ran to the storehouse. Empty. He ran to the beach. Empty. He came back to the skeleton. The only resident of Roanoke. The settlers gathered around him in a tight circle. They were no longer looking at the grapes or the tall trees. They were looking at the dark wall of the forest. Where are they? Someone whispered. Where are the other 14? This is the question that introduces the horror. If there had been a battle, there would be 15 bodies. The natives of the region, the Secatan and the Croatoan, did not hide their kills. In war, they left their enemies on the field as a warning. If the men had died of disease, of plague, or dysentery, their bodies would be in the beds, all buried in a row with crosses. But to find one? Just one body, killed violently, and left to rot in the center of the camp? And the other 14 simply erased? It implies that the one man was not just a casualty. He was a symbol. Perhaps he was the sentry. The one left on guard while the others went. Where? To the beach? Into the woods? Or perhaps he was the last one left alive. Imagine the psychological terror of being the last soldier. 14 of your friends have vanished, one by one, taken by the woods. You are alone in the fort. You lock the doors. You clutch your musket. You watch the sun go down, knowing that the thing that took them is coming back for you. And then the door bursts open. White stood over the bones. He knew he had to say something. He had to stop the panic before it started. They must have gone to the mainland, he lied. They must have taken the boat and gone further inland. This poor soul, he must have been left behind. An accident. But the settlers looked at the shattered skull. They knew an accident does not crush a man's head. An accident does not strip a fort of all its weapons, because that was the other detail. The weapons were gone. The muskets, the powder, the swords of the garrison, all gone. The skeleton was unarmed. This discovery changed the soul of the colony. If they had arrived and found nothing, they might have been cautious. If they had arrived and found 15 graves, they might have been sad. But finding one skeleton and 14 mysteries, it planted a seed of paranoia that would grow into madness. They buried the man. They dug a shallow grave in the sandy soil and said a prayer. Earth to earth, ashes to ashes, dust to dust. But as they shoveled the dirt onto the bones, they felt the eyes of the island on them. The settlers moved into the houses of the dead men. They cleaned out the vines. They repaired the roofs. They tried to make it a home, but they could not scrub away the feeling of the previous tenants. At night, the wind howled through the cracks in the walls. And in the howling, the settlers thought they heard voices. English voices. Help us, the wind seemed to say. Run, Eleanor Dare, heavy with the child who would be named Virginia, could not sleep. She wrote in her journal pages that are now lost to history of dreams. Dreams of men standing at the edge of the forest, their mouths open in silent screams. Their bodies turning into trees. The single skeleton was the first domino. It proved that the protection of the crown meant nothing here. The 15 soldiers were the Queen's men. They had armor. They had guns. And they were wiped out like insects. What chance did a group of farmers and families have? The discovery of the skeleton also created a rift between Governor White and the pilot, Simon Fernandez. Fernandez wanted to leave. He wanted to drop the settlers and sail back to the Caribbean to hunt for Spanish gold. He didn't care about the bones. They are dead, Fernandez said coldly. The living must eat. He refused to take the settlers to a safer location further north to the Chesapeake Bay as originally planned. You stay here, Fernandez ordered. This is your home now. He marooned them. He marooned them in a graveyard. And so the 115 settlers unpacked their trunks. Next to the fresh grave of the unknown soldier, they tried to build a civilization on top of a crime scene, but there is a deeper layer to this skeleton. A layer that modern forensic historians have only recently begun to discuss in hushed tones. Bones tell stories. If you look at the reports of similar discoveries from that era, you find anomalies. When a body decomposes in the woods, the bones are usually scattered. Wolves, bears, and foxes drag the limbs away. A skull might be found half a mile from the ribcage, but the skeleton of Roanoke was intact. The ribs were aligned. The legs were straight. This means that after the man was killed, nothing touched him. The wolves did not eat him. The bears did not maul him. Why? Why would the scavengers of the forest avoid a fresh meal? Unless the body was tainted, unless the man died of something that even the animals instinctively feared. Unless the predators of that island were not wolves and bears at all. There are legends among the local tribes, the Algonquin-speaking peoples, of a spirit that possesses men, a spirit of hunger. The Wendigo is the northern name, but the concept exists in many forms. A spirit that turns men into cannibals. A spirit that corrupts the flesh so that nature itself rejects it. Did the other 14 soldiers turn on this man? Did they kill him in a frenzy of madness and then flee into the woods, transformed into something else? Was the shattered skull not the result of a war club, but the result of a desperate struggle between men who had lost their minds? The settlers didn't know about these legends. They only knew that the animals wouldn't touch the grave. They noticed that their own dogs, the mastiffs they had brought from England, would not go near the spot where the skeleton was found. The dogs would whine and tuck their tails, staring at the empty patch of grass. Growling at the air, animals see what we cannot. And the dogs knew that the soldier was not alone, as the weeks turned into months. The colony tried to survive. Virginia Dare was born. A spark of life in the gloom, but the shadow of the skeleton hung over them. Every time a settler went into the woods to gather firewood, the others held their breath until he returned. Every time the sun went down, they barred the doors. They were waiting. They were waiting for the thing that killed the soldier to come back, and eventually it did, but it didn't come with war cries. It didn't come with guns, it came with silence. Governor White would eventually leave them to get help. He would sail away on the Hopewell, watching the smoke of their fires fade into the distance. He didn't know that he was leaving them to the same fate as the skeleton. He didn't know that the next time he saw this place, 3 years later, there would be no bodies at all. Not even one. The skeleton was the prologue. The disappearance was the main chapter. But what happened in between? What happened in those 3 years of isolation? When White left, he promised to return quickly. But history had other plans, and while he was gone, the settlers began to see things. They began to realize that the Croatoan tribe might be their only salvation, or their doom, because buried in the pocket of that skeleton, hidden in the tatters of his remaining clothes, was a clue. A clue that wasn't mentioned in the official reports. A small, carved stone. A stone that bore a name not of this world, to understand the end. We must read the stone. The greatest tragedy of the Lost Colony was not what happened in the woods of America. It was what happened in the palaces of England. We are often told that Governor John White left his family to get supplies and simply could not return due to bad weather. This is a sanitized lie. The truth is that he was a prisoner of the Crown's ambition when White arrived in England. Begging for ships to save his daughter and newborn granddaughter, he was met with a wall of silence. Queen Elizabeth I had issued a stay of shipping. Every vessel, every plank of wood. Every cannon was seized for the war against Spain. John White stood in the ports of London, watching the ships that could have saved his family be repurposed for war. He held the Queen's warrant in his hand, but it was worthless against the machinery of the state. For 3 years, the Empire chose victory over the lives of 115 pioneers. They were not forgotten. They were sacrificed. They were the collateral damage of the Spanish Armada. While London cheered for the defeat of the Spanish fleet, a small colony across the ocean was slowly starving in the silence, waiting for a sail that the Queen had forbidden to leave the harbor. This is the truth the king buried. Now. Let the sound of the cannons fade. Let the cheers of the victory parades die down into the fog. We must turn the pages back to the moment of separation. The year is 1587, late August. The air is heavy with the scent of salt and imminent rain. We are back on the sandy shores of Roanoke Island, standing at the water's edge. The ship, the Lion, is preparing to weigh anchor. The sailors are hauling on the ropes, their rhythmic chants drifting over the waves. Imagine the feeling in your chest, the tightness, the unbearable weight of saying goodbye when you do not know it will be forever. Let us stand beside John White one last time. It was never meant to be a long journey. John White did not want to leave. He was the governor. His place was with his people. But the colony was desperate. They had arrived too late in the season to plant crops. The supplies were dwindling. The single skeleton they found had rattled their nerves. They needed support. They needed the Crown to know they were alive. The settlers had voted. They begged him to go. "You have the ear of the court," they said. "You can bring us food. You can bring us soldiers." And so, with a heavy heart, he boarded the longboat. He looked back at the beach. Standing there, in the white sand, was his daughter. Eleanor Dare. She was holding her baby, Virginia, wrapped in a linen cloth against the biting wind. Virginia was only 9 days old. The first English child born in the New World, a tiny, fragile life on the edge of a savage wilderness, Eleanor did not cry. She was a woman of the Tudor era, strong and stoic. She raised her hand in a wave. White waved back. He shouted across the water, "I will return before Easter. I promise." The oars dipped. The boat pulled away. The figures on the beach grew smaller, until they were just specks against the dark green wall of the forest dot, and then they were gone. White climbed aboard the ship. He stood at the stern rail, watching the island disappear into the horizon. He clutched the list of supplies in his pocket. Corn, muskets, powder, tools. He visualized the return trip. He calculated the winds. 3 months to England. A month to gather supplies. 3 months back. He would be home by spring. He did not know that the doors of history were slamming shut behind him. He did not know that he was sailing into a world that was about to catch fire. The crossing was brutal. But the arrival in England was worse. When White landed in November 1587, he did not find a welcoming committee. He found a nation in panic. Rumors were flying through the streets of London like rats. The Spanish Empire, the greatest power on earth, was gathering a massive fleet. The Invincible Armada. Their goal was simple: invasion. To burn London, depose the Queen, and bring England back under the heel of the Pope. Every man in England was mobilized. Every ship was commandeered. White ran to his patron, Sir Walter Raleigh. Raleigh was a powerful man, a favorite of the Queen. Surely he could help, but Raleigh's eyes were distracted. He was looking at maps of the English Channel, not maps of Virginia. "I cannot spare a ship, John," Raleigh said. "The Queen has issued a Privy Council order. No vessel may leave these shores. We need every gun." "But my family," White pleaded. "My granddaughter." "If Spain lands," Raleigh replied, "we will all be dead. And your granddaughter will be a subject of Philip II. White was trapped. Imagine the psychological torture of those months. He was safe in London. He had a warm bed. He had food. But every time he ate a hot meal, he wondered if Eleanor was starving. Every time he heard the rain against the window, he wondered if the roof of the cottage in Roanoke was leaking. He walked the docks of the Thames, staring at the ships chained to the quay. Ships that could save them, but they were guarded by soldiers. The winter of 1588 came, cold, gray, relentless. In Roanoke, the snow would be falling on the palisade. The food stores would be running low. White tried to smuggle supplies. He found 2 small pinnaces, tiny ships considered too weak for war, whose captains were willing to risk the run for a high price. He loaded them with food. He boarded one himself. They slipped out of the harbor, but luck is a cruel mistress. Out in the open ocean they were attacked. Not by the Spanish, but by French pirates. The Brave and the Roe, the 2 small ships, were outgunned. The pirates boarded them. They stripped the ships of everything. The food, the tools, the gifts for the settlers. White was wounded in the fight. Bleeding and humiliated, the ships were forced to limp back to England. He had failed, and now the Armada was here. 1588 passed. The Great Sea Battle was fought. The Spanish Armada was smashed by the English cannons and the Protestant wind. That drove them onto the rocks of Ireland. England rejoiced. Bonfires were lit, bells rang out, but John White did not cheer, because victory did not mean freedom. The seas were still dangerous. The ban on shipping remained. 1589 came and went. 2 years. What happens to a colony in 2 years without supply? The initial stores would be gone. The seeds they brought might have failed in the alien soil. The trade with the natives might have soured. White sat in his room in London, looking at his own drawings of the island. He traced the faces of the people he had left behind. He began to hear whispers in the court. People were already speaking of Roanoke in the past tense. They called it the Lost Plantation. They are likely dead, John, people told him softly. Give up. But a father cannot give up. Finally, in the spring of 1590, the ban was lifted. A privateer expedition, led by a man named John Watts, was preparing to sail to the Caribbean to raid Spanish treasure ships. White begged for passage. I will take you, Watts said, but I will not take supplies. My ships are for war, not for charity. You can come, but you are just a passenger. White accepted. He had no choice. He would go back empty-handed. But at least he would go back. He boarded the ship. Hopewell, he was going home, but he was 3 years late. The voyage across the Atlantic in 1590 was haunted. White spent his days on the prow, staring west. The ocean seemed endless. The crew was rough. They were privateers, pirates with a license. They stopped to capture Spanish prizes. They wasted time chasing merchant vessels while White paced the deck, grinding his teeth. We must make haste, he would shout. We go where the gold is, Governor, the captain would laugh. Every delay felt like a dagger. Finally, in August, the hurricane season, they saw the coast, the outer banks, the treacherous sandbars that protected the inner sounds. The weather turned against them. A storm rose up, lashing the ships with rain and wind. They lost an anchor. 7 sailors drowned trying to launch a boat in the surf. It was as if the island was trying to push them away. As if it didn't want them to see what had happened, but White was relentless. Push on. He screamed over the roar of the gale. We are so close. On the evening of August 17th, they saw a flicker of light. Fire. A plume of smoke rising from the north end of Roanoke Island. White's heart leaped. Fire meant life. Fire meant people. They are there, he cried. They are signaling us. The crew cheered. They fired a cannon to signal their return. Boom. The sound rolled over the water. They waited for a response. A musket shot. A shout. Silence. The smoke continued to rise, twisting into the gray sky. Night fell. It was too dangerous to land in the dark. So they anchored offshore, watching the fire. White did not sleep. He imagined Eleanor sitting by that fire. He imagined Virginia, now a 3-year-old toddler, playing in the light. He rehearsed what he would say. He would apologize. He would explain the war, the queen, the pirates. He would beg for forgiveness. The sun rose on August 18th. It was his granddaughter's 3rd birthday. The boats were lowered. They rowed toward the plume of smoke. But as they got closer, the hope began to die. The fire was not a signal fire. It was a brush fire. A lightning strike or a spark that had caught the dry grass. It was burning wildly, uncontrolled. There were no people around it. No figures running to greet them. White stepped onto the beach. He walked past the fire. He walked toward the settlement. He walked into the silence that we described at the beginning. The silence of 3 years. He found the palisade. He found the word Croatoan, but he realized something else in that moment. Something that broke him. The 3 years of delay had not just been a pause. They had been a sentence. If he had returned in 1588, they might have been there. If he had returned in 1589, they might have been weak, but alive. But 1590? 1590 was the year the lease ran out. He stood before the tree, his fingers tracing the letters, and the realization washed over him. He wasn't a savior. He was a ghost visiting a graveyard, and the message on the tree wasn't just a location. It was a final testament. And this brings us to the next piece of the puzzle. The piece that the history books often gloss over, because while the people were gone, they left behind traces. Subtle, terrifying traces that suggested they hadn't just moved to Croatoan. They suggested that the colony had split, that there was a civil war on this tiny island. And that one group went south to the friendly natives. But the other group, the group that possessed the Dare Stone, they went west into the deep interior, into the land of the enemy. Why did they split? What horror drove a wedge between the survivors? To find the answer, we must follow the stone. We have been reading the word wrong for 400 years. Every history book tells you that Croatoan was a destination. They tell you it was a signpost pointing to a nearby island, a friendly tribe, a safe haven. But look closer at the carving. Look at the lack of distress signals. Look at the precision of the letters. In the secret archives of the Elizabethan spy network, operated by Sir Francis Walsingham, words were often used as ciphers, codes to contain threats that the public could not handle. What if Croatoan wasn't a place the settlers were going to? What if it was a label for what they had become? New theories suggest that the colony had encountered a biological threat, a pathogen so ancient and contagious that to return to England would mean the end of the world. They didn't leave the message to tell John White where to find them. They carved it to tell him to stay away. Croatoan wasn't a map. It was a biohazard warning. It was a quarantine seal on a tomb. And when John White saw it, he didn't follow them. Because deep down, he knew exactly what the code meant. This is the truth the king buried. Now. Let the panic of the code fade into the grain of the wood. Visualize the tree. A massive live oak, its branches twisting like the arms of an old man. Covered in the gray beard of Spanish moss. It is standing at the entrance of the empty fort. The sun is setting behind it, casting long, crooked shadows across the abandoned earth. We are going to step closer to that tree. We are going to run our fingers over the bark. We are going to feel the grooves of the letters, cut deep by a knife held in a steady hand. T, O, N. Let us unravel the mystery of the alphabet. Let us analyze the evidence with the eyes of a forensic historian. When a man is terrified, his handwriting degrades. If the settlers were being chased by Spanish soldiers or hunted by hostile warriors, the carving would be frantic. It would be shallow. The lines would be jagged. The letters would slant. But the carving John White found was perfect. It was executed with a serif, the small decorative strokes at the end of the letters. It was carved at eye level. It was carved deep enough to withstand the rain and the wind. For 3 years. This tells us something crucial about the psychology of the carver. He was not afraid of immediate violence. He had time. He stood there, perhaps for an hour, chipping away at the hard oak bark. He was calm, but it was the calmness of a man who has accepted his fate. Remember the instruction John White gave them? If you are in distress, carve a cross. There was no cross. This absence is the loudest sound in the story. If they were starving, that is distress. If they were under attack, that is distress. So, if they left the island and they were not in distress, why did they dismantle their houses? Why did they bury their trunks? This paradox leads us to the darkest theory of all. They weren't fleeing an enemy. They were fleeing themselves. In 1587, the world was small, but the invisible world, the world of bacteria and viruses, was vast and unknown. Europe had been ravaged by the Black Death. They knew what plague looked like: buboes, fever, blackened skin. But the New World held new sicknesses, ancient things that had been sleeping in the soil, in the water, in the blood of the animals. What if the settlers uncovered something? Imagine the first patient, perhaps a child, a fever that wouldn't break, a rash that formed strange geometric patterns, a madness that made them speak in tongues. The colony's doctor was dead. Remember, they had no physician of high standing. They had only folk remedies, herbs, prayer, but the sickness spread, and then the realization hit the leaders of the colony: if they stayed in the fort, they would all die. If they signaled a ship, and that ship took them back to England, they would bring this curse to London. They would be the architects of the apocalypse. They faced a choice that is almost impossible to imagine. The ultimate sacrifice. We must remember who organized this voyage: Sir Walter Raleigh. And behind them, the Queen's spy network. These men were not just explorers. They were agents of the state. It is highly probable that the leaders of the expedition were given contingency protocols, secret orders to be opened only in the event of a catastrophic failure. Was Croatoan one of those protocols? In the Algonquin language, the word has roots connected to talking or counsel, but in the cipher books of the Elizabethan court, names were often used to designate status. Croatoan could have been the designation for compromised, or native integration required, or permanent exile. Imagine the town meeting. The 115 people gathering in the center of the camp, the healthy standing on one side, the sick standing on the other. They decide to enact the protocol. They will not wait for John White. They cannot waiting for John White, because if he comes, he will be infected too. So they clean the camp. They dismantle the houses to remove the infected wood. They bury the possessions to sterilize the ground. And they leave the sign, a sign that looks like a destination to the uninitiated, but a warning to the governor. We have gone to Croatoan, meaning we have crossed the line. We have gone into the quarantine zone. Do not follow. This explains why White, despite his grief, did not try harder to reach the island of Croatoan, which is only 50 miles away. The history books say the weather stopped him. The storm broke his anchor cable. The crew mutinied. All true. But are those reasons, or are they excuses? Did John White look at that tree, read the code, and feel a wave of cold relief? Did he realize that he couldn't go after them? That saving them would mean dooming his soul? Perhaps the storm was a convenient alibi for a father who knew he had to let his daughter go. So, where is this place? Where is the quarantine zone? Today we call it Hatteras Island, a thin strip of sand battling the Atlantic Ocean. In 1590, it was the home of the Croatoan people led by Montejo, a Native American who had traveled to London and was a friend of the English. If the settlers went there for sanctuary, Montejo would have taken them in. But here is where the biology meets the history. The Croatoan people survived. The English settlers vanished. If it was a plague, why didn't the tribe die? Perhaps the sickness wasn't a virus. Perhaps it was something in the food. Something in the rye bread, ergot poisoning, a fungus that grows on damp rye grain. It causes hallucinations, convulsions, gangrene. It makes people feel like their skin is on fire. It makes them paranoid. In the Middle Ages, they called it St. Anthony's fire. Later in Salem, Massachusetts, historians believe it was the cause of the witchcraft hysteria. Did the Roanoke settlers eat infected grain during that wet, humid summer? Did they start to hallucinate? Did they believe they were being hunted by demons? Did the protocol Croatoan mean we are losing our minds? We are going to the natives to beg for their medicine? This fits the no-cross detail perfectly. You don't carve a distress cross if you think the enemy is inside your own head. You carve the name of the only people who might have the cure. They went to Croatoan not as conquerors, but as patients. And did they survive? This is where the story moves from theory to genetic fact, decades later. When English explorers finally moved south into the Carolinas, they found something that stopped them in their tracks. They found the Lumbee tribe. And the Catawba, these people did not look like the other tribes. They had gray eyes. They had light brown hair. Some of them had surnames: Dare, White, Cooper, Stevens. The names of the lost list. They spoke a dialect of English that sounded like it came from the time of Shakespeare. They had stone houses. They farmed like Europeans. The settlers did survive. But they didn't survive as English men and women. To survive the quarantine, they had to stop being English. They had to melt into the landscape. They had to marry into the tribes, abandon their heavy clothes, abandon their queen, and abandon their god. The Croatoan code was the end of their identity. There is a dark twist to this integration theory. If they integrated peacefully, why did they never send a message back? Why, for 100 years, did they hide from the ships passing by? Usually shipwreck survivors light fires on the beach. They wave flags. They want to be rescued. The Roanoke survivors hid. They moved further inland into the swamps of Robeson County. They disappeared into the mist. Why hide from your own people? Unless the secret they were protecting was still active, unless they knew that if they made contact, the British Empire would finish. The job they started in 1587, the job of erasure, because there is one piece of evidence we haven't discussed yet, the map that John White brought back to the Queen, the map that sits in the British Museum today. It has a patch on it, a piece of paper glued over a section of the coastline, hiding what was underneath for centuries. No one knew what was under that patch until recently, until scientists put the map under a light box and looked through the paper, and what they found changes the meaning of Croatoan forever. It wasn't just a quarantine. It was a military target. Under the patch there is a symbol. It is a star. The symbol of a fort located 50 miles inland, away from Croatoan Island. This means John White knew about a second location, a secret base, a Site B. The carving on the tree might have been a diversion, a lie to send the Spanish or the unauthorized English to the island, while the real survivors went to the secret fort hidden under the patch. Croatoan was a decoy. The real survivors went to the place the Queen erased from the map. And if they went there, they didn't go alone. They took something with them, something heavy, something that required the strength of 20 men to move. They took the Dare Stone. And on that stone, they carved the final, bloody chapter of their story. Next, we must peel back the patch and rid the stone. While we look for ghosts in the forest and viruses in the soil, we often forget the most obvious monster of 1587. The monster was not a spirit. It was a ship. In the archives of Seville, there are documents stained with seawater and time that prove the Spanish Empire knew exactly where Roanoke was. To them, the colony wasn't a settlement. It was a pirate base. It was a nest of heretics sitting on the edge of their new world, threatening their gold fleets. And the punishment for heresy was not just death. It was erasure. We know that a Spanish hunter-killer squadron was dispatched from Florida with one specific order: find the English city and burn it to the root. The Croatoan carving might not have been a message for John White. It might have been a desperate signal that the enemy had already landed. That the ghost ship they saw on the horizon wasn't a hallucination, it was the Inquisition coming to claim them. The settlers didn't just vanish. They were hunted down, shackled, and dragged into the dark hold of a Spanish galleon, never to be seen again. This is the truth the king buried. Now. Let the sound of the chains fade. Let us turn our eyes away from the land and look out toward the sea. Imagine the Atlantic Ocean at twilight. The water is a deep, bruised purple. The sky is a sheet of gray velvet. The horizon is a blur where the water meets the air. You are standing on the dunes of Roanoke. The wind is whipping your hair. The salt spray stings your eyes. You are watching the line where the world ends. You are waiting for a sail for 3 years. The settlers watched this line. They prayed for a sail. But in the 16th century, a sail could mean salvation. Or it could mean slaughter. Let us drift into the fear of the horizon. To understand why the Spanish theory is so compelling, we must understand the world of 1587. It was a world divided. A world at war. On one side, the Protestant Queen Elizabeth of England. On the other, the Catholic King Philip II of Spain. They were not just enemies. They were opposites. And the Atlantic Ocean was their chessboard. Spain claimed the entire New World. To them, North America was not free land. It was the property of the Vatican, gifted to Spain by the Pope. Any Englishman found on these shores was not considered a settler. He was considered a pirate, a trespasser, a thief stealing from God. When Sir Walter Raleigh sent the settlers to Roanoke, he wasn't just building a farm. He was planting a dagger in the side of the Spanish Empire. Roanoke was perfectly positioned. It was hidden behind the treacherous sandbars of the Outer Banks, invisible from the open sea. But it was close enough to the Gulf Stream, the highway of the ocean, to strike at the Spanish. Treasure fleets carrying gold from Mexico to Spain. The Spanish knew this. Their spies and London men who whispered in dark taverns and read the Queen's private mail had sent warnings to Madrid. The English are building a nest, the report said. They are building a fortress in the mist. And so down in St. Augustine, Florida, the great Spanish stronghold of the South, the governor received an order: locate the heretics and destroy them. Imagine the psychological state of the Roanoke settlers. They knew they were trespassing. They knew that if the Spanish found them, there would be no trial. There would be no mercy. Every morning when the sun rose over the water, they checked the horizon. Is today the day? Is today the day the great wooden crosses of the Spanish galleons appear out of the fog? We often think of Roanoke as a secret. But secrets in the 16th century were hard to keep. In 1588, while John White was trapped in England, a Spanish captain named Pedro de Jubior captured an English ship in the Caribbean. on that ship. He found papers, he found maps, he found the pilot's logs. He found the exact location of the city of Raleigh. The secret was out. The Spanish governor in Florida, Pedro Menendez de Marx, began to assemble a fleet. He was not a man of half measures. He had previously wiped out a French colony at Fort Caroline, slaughtering every man, woman, and child to protect Spanish interests. He planned to do the same to Roanoke. He called it the Enterprise of Virginia. He gathered his soldiers. He sharpened his swords. He waited for the springtide's dot, and this brings us to the moment of the disappearance. The timeline matches perfectly. The Spanish were hunting for Roanoke in the exact years the colony vanished. So, let us reconstruct the scene. Not as a supernatural mystery, but as a military tragedy. Is a morning in late 1589. The air is cool. The mist is clinging to the coastline. A sentry stands on the dunes. He is tired. His clothes are ragged. He is hungry. He squints into the gray light. He sees a shape, a black geometric shape against the gray sky. A sail. His heart leaps. Is it Governor White? Is it the Hopewell? Is it food? Is it news from home? He runs to the bell. He rings it. Clang, clang, dong, the settlers run from their houses. Eleanor Dare runs out with her child. They gather on the beach, weeping with joy. They wave their arms. They light a signal fire, but as the ship draws closer, the joy turns to ice. The ship is huge. It sits high in the water. It has 3 decks of cannons. And on the mainsail, painted in blood red, is the cross of Burgundy. The jagged cross of the Spanish Empire. It is not a rescue. It is an executioner. Panic. Absolute primal panic. They cannot fight. They have no large cannons. Their gunpowder is old. They are farmers, not soldiers, and the Spanish are the finest infantry in the world. What do? You have minutes. Maybe an hour before the longboats land. You cannot surrender. You know what they do to heretics? You must run, but you cannot just run. You must hide the evidence. You must buy time. If the Spanish find the fort, they will burn it. But if they find nothing, maybe they will think the English have already left. Maybe they won't pursue into the deep woods. So the cleanup begins. This theory explains why the houses were dismantled. If you leave a house standing, the enemy can use it. The enemy can sleep in your bed. The enemy can turn your fort into their fort. So you tear it down. You hide the supplies. You bury the cannons so they cannot be turned against you. You enact the scorched earth policy, and you leave a message for John White. Croatoan. But in this context, Croatoan means we have fled to the friendly tribe because the Spanish are here. It wasn't a casual move. It was a tactical retreat. They grabbed what they could carry. They ran into the dark, tangled forests of the mainland, hoping the Spanish soldiers weighed down by heavy armor would not follow them into the swamps. But there is a darker version of this theory. What if they didn't run fast enough? What if the Spanish landed, surrounded the village, and took them alive? The Spanish Empire ran on labor. They had silver mines in Mexico. They had sugar plantations in the Caribbean. They always needed bodies. Would they slaughter 100 healthy English people? Or would they sell them? There are whispers in the logs of Havana Harbor from the 1590s, mentions of fair-skinned slaves, mentions of captives who spoke a strange northern tongue, mentions of English, heretics working the docks, their spirits broken, their names forgotten. Imagine the horror of Eleanor Dare, not dying in the woods, but living out her days in a Spanish dungeon in Cuba. looking north across the ocean, knowing her father was looking for her. But knowing she was hidden in the belly of the beast, this explains the lack of bodies. If you capture a population, you don't leave skeletons. You march them onto the ships. You clean the site. You leave nothing behind. The Spanish were efficient, and the Croatoan sign. Perhaps it was a trick. Perhaps the Spanish carved it. Think about it. If you capture a colony, and you know the English governor is coming back, you want to lead him into a trap, or you want to send him on a wild goose chase, you carve Croatoan on a tree. You know he will go there. You know he will waste his time searching the wrong island, while your galleons slip away with his family in the hold. It was a decoy. A piece of counterintelligence left by a Spanish captain to confuse the English search party, and it worked. John White saw the sign. He thought they were safe. He didn't know they were already in chains, sailing south. It is a chilling theory. It fits the politics of the time perfectly, but there is a flaw. If the Spanish destroyed Roanoke, they would have bragged about it. The Spanish king, Philip II, loved to announce his victories. When he destroyed the French colony in Florida, he published it. He made a medal. He wanted the world to know that this land was his. But in the Spanish archives, there is no mission accomplished report for Roanoke. There are orders to find it. There are maps searching for it, but there is no letter saying, "We found them." In fact, years later, the Spanish were still looking for Roanoke. They sent expeditions up the coast in 1600, 1605, 1609. They were terrified that the English were still there, hiding in the fog. This suggests something even stranger. The Spanish arrived and found the city already empty. Imagine the Spanish captain landing on the beach, sword in hand, ready for battle. He marched to the fort. He expects a fight, and he finds silence. He finds the dismantled houses. He finds the overgrown gardens. He finds the word Croatoan. He stands there, confused. He crosses himself. "Madre de Dios," he whispers. Where did they go? Even the Spanish, the greatest power on earth, were spooked by the silence of Roanoke. They left. They sailed away, reporting back to the king that the English had vanished into thin air. So, if the Spanish didn't take them, and if the settlers didn't die of plague. Where did they go? We must look back at the map. The map with the patch, because if they were hiding from the Spanish, they wouldn't go to the coast. The coast is vulnerable. The coast is where the ships are. They would go inland, deep inland. To the one place where a ship cannot follow. They went to the city of Raleigh, the secret backup site, but the journey to that site was not easy. It required moving 100 people through a landscape they did not understand. A landscape they did not understand. A landscape filled with spirits, with ancient tribes, and with the growing darkness of the Little Ice Age. And on that journey, they began to leave markers, not carvings on trees, but stones. Stones covered in writing. Stones that tell a story so tragic, it was dismissed as a hoax for 50 years. But now, we are looking at those stones again. The Spanish ships faded into the fog. The ocean remained empty. But the stones remained. And the first stone tells us who died first. We often search for the killer of Roanoke in the shadows of the forest, or in the cannons of Spanish ships. But the true killer was already inside the walls of the fort. It was a killer that didn't bleed, didn't speak, and didn't move for centuries. Local legends in North Carolina spoke of a curse. They said the settlers didn't die. They stiffened. They said their skin turned gray and cracked like bark. They said they stood still for so long, waiting for a ship that never came, that they simply took root and became the trees themselves. We dismissed this as folklore, a ghost story to scare children, but in 1998, scientists from the University of Arkansas drilled into the hearts of 800-year-old bald cypress trees near Roanoke, and inside the wood, they found the terrifying truth. The year 1587 wasn't just a bad year. It was the driest year in the last 1,000 years. The settlers were victims of a mega drought, a climate event so severe, so sudden, that it turned the earth to dust and the rivers to salt. The disease of wood wasn't magic. It was extreme, hallucination-inducing dehydration. It was the horror of watching your own body dry out until you looked, felt, and broke. Just like a dead branch. This is the truth the king buried. Now. Let the moisture leave the air. Imagine the humidity of the swamp evaporating. Imagine the lush green leaves turning brown and brittle, crumbling between your fingers. We are going back to the summer of 1587, but it is not the summer we imagine. It is a summer of white sun and cracked earth. You are standing in the center of the fort. The heat is shimmering off the ground. There is no sound of birds. Even the insects have burrowed deep into the ground to escape the sun. You lick your lips, but there is no moisture. You reach for the water barrel, but the ladle scrapes the bottom with a hollow wooden sound. Let us explore the year the world dried up. History is usually written in ink, but the truest history is written in cellulose. Every year, a tree grows a ring. A wide ring means rain, growth, life. A narrow ring means struggle, dryness, death. When the dendrochronologists, the tree ring scientists, looked at the samples from Roanoke Island, they expected to see average growth. Instead, they found an anomaly. The rings for 1587, 1588, and 1589 were microscopically thin. They were almost invisible. This data tells us a story that no letter could capture. It tells us that when the settlers landed in July 1587, they landed in the middle of the worst drought in 800 years. This was not bad luck. This was a geological trap. The aquifer, the underground fresh water, would have shrunk. As the fresh water retreated, the salt water from the ocean would have seeped in to fill the void. This is the invisible killer. The settlers dug wells. They drank the water. It looked clear. It looked cold, but it was brackish. It was laced with salt. And when you drink salt water, you do not quench your thirst. You accelerate it. The salt pulls the moisture from your cells. Your brain begins to shrink. Your blood thickens, and your skin begins to change. Let us imagine the physical transformation of Eleanor Dare, or the pilot, Simon Fernandez, or the young children. The first stage is thirst. A thirst so deep it becomes a physical weight in the stomach. The second stage is lethargy. You stop moving. You sit in the shade of the house, staring at the wall. Movement requires energy. Energy requires water. So you become still. This is where the statue legend begins. The settlers would have spent days, perhaps weeks, sitting perfectly still to conserve sweat. To an outsider, they would look like carvings. The third stage is the bark skin. Severe dehydration causes the skin to lose its elasticity. It becomes gray. It becomes rough. It cracks and bleeds, but the blood is thick and dark. If you touch their arms, they would feel hard, rigid, like wood. The fourth stage, is the madness. The brain, starved of water, begins to misfire. Hallucinations begin. They would have seen ships on the horizon that weren't there. They would have seen rivers of fresh water flowing through the sand. They would have heard the voice of God telling them to walk into the forest. This explains the lack of struggle. They weren't fighting a war against the Spanish. They were fighting a war against their own biology, and they were losing. The drought didn't just affect the people. It affected the island. The deer would have died or migrated inland. The crops, the corn and the wheat they planted with such hope would have turned to yellow dust in the fields. The city of Raleigh became a tomb of dry timber. This sheds new light on the relationship. With the Native Americans, we often wonder why the local tribes didn't help them more. Why didn't the Secotun or the Croatoan bring them water? Because the drought affected them too. In a mega drought, charity dies. Every village, every tribe, every family is fighting for the same dwindling water sources. The natives knew where the deep springs were. They knew the secret places in the swamp where the water was still sweet, but they couldn't share it with 115 thirsty mouths. To share the water would mean death for their own children. So the tribes pulled back. They retreated into the deep interior. They left the English alone on their sandbar. The settlers were not just abandoned by England. They were abandoned by the earth itself. So the decision to leave Roanoke was not a choice. It was a biological imperative. You cannot stay where there is no water. The Croatoan carving wasn't just a location. It was a desperate hope. We are going to the island of Croatoan because we believe there is water there. But there is a flaw in this plan. Croatoan, Hatteras Island, is a barrier island. It is mostly sand. In a mega drought, it would be just as dry as Roanoke if they went there. They went from one desert to another. This leads us to the new theory. The theory that the settlers didn't go south to Croatoan. They went west. They went to the mouth of the Albemarle Sound. They went to the Chowan River. Why there? Because rivers flow from the mountains. Even in a drought, the great rivers still have water deep upstream. The wood sickness drove them inland. Imagine the march, 100 people. Their skin cracked, their tongues swollen, stumbling away from the coast. Carrying their children who were too weak to walk, they left the heavy cannons. They left the books. They left the armor. You cannot eat armor. You cannot drink ink. They took only what they could carry, and they walked into the setting sun. And as they walked, they began to die. One by one. And where they fell. They stayed. The dry air mummified them, and years later, when travelers saw these preserved, gray, rigid bodies lying in the woods, they whispered the legend. They turned to wood. Why is this a secret? Why didn't John White know? Because weather records didn't exist in 1590. John White returned 3 years later. When the rains had returned, when he landed in 1590, the island was green again. The vines were growing. The deer were back. He looked at the lush forest and thought, they could have survived here. There is food. There is water. He didn't know that 3 years earlier this green paradise was a brown wasteland. He blamed the Spanish. He blamed the natives. He blamed himself. He never suspected the climate, the mega drought, was the perfect crime. It killed the colony, and then the rain came back and washed away the evidence. The trees held the secret. They held it in their rings, locked inside the wood, waiting 400 years for a drill to release the truth. But if they walked west, if they walked toward the rivers, they would have encountered something else. They would have encountered the empires of the interior. The powerful tribes that controlled the riverheads, and these tribes were not like the coastal fishermen. They were warriors, and they did not welcome strangers who looked like walking corpses. This brings us to the Dare Stone. Because if you are dying of thirst, and you are being hunted, and you have one last message to leave for the world, ... you don't carve it on a tree. Trees rot. Trees burn, you carve it on something that lasts forever, you carve it on stone, ... the wood rots. The flesh dries. But the stone remains ... and the stone tells us exactly who died. First, there is a document in the royal archives that historians have whispered about for centuries, but few have dared to fully understand. It is not a letter of rescue. It is a warrant of erasure. We like to believe that Queen Elizabeth I wept for her lost subjects. We like to believe she spent her nights praying for the safety of the women and children, stranded in the New World. But Elizabeth was not just a mother to her people. She was a monarch at war. And in war, a compromised asset is a liability. New evidence suggests that when the Spanish Armada threatened England, a secret order was drafted by the Queen's spy master, Sir Francis Walsingham. The order concerned the city of Raleigh. It did not command a rescue mission. It commanded a denial of assets. The logic was brutal and simple. If England could not hold the fort, then Spain must not have it. The houses, the maps, the codes, and perhaps even the people were classified as crown secrets. And if those secrets were at risk of falling into the hands of the Inquisition, the order was clear: destroy everything, leave nothing. But silence. The settlers didn't just vanish. They were redacted. This is the truth the king buried. Now ... Let us leave the bright sun of the American coast. Let us travel back across the gray, heaving Atlantic, to the heart of the empire, to the dark wood-paneled chambers of Greenwich Palace. It is late at night. The year is 1588. The air is thick with the smell of beeswax candles and damp velvet. Outside, the fog of the River Thames presses against the leaded glass windows. Inside, the only sound is the scratching of a quill on parchment and the crackle of a dying fire. We are entering the room where history is written. Not the history of the public squares, but the shadow history of the state. Let us stand in the corner of the room and listen to the whispers of the Queen's Council. To understand the fate of Roanoke, we must understand the mind of Sir Francis Walsingham. He was the Queen's eyes and ears. He was the man who built the first modern intelligence agency. He intercepted letters, broke codes, and infiltrated the courts of Europe. To Walsingham, the world was a chessboard, and Roanoke was a pawn. The colony was established to be a pirate base, a thorn in the side of Spain. But by 1588, with the Spanish Armada sailing toward England, Roanoke had become something else. It had become a vulnerability. Walsingham knew that the Spanish were hunting for the colony. He knew that if the Spanish captured Roanoke, they would not just kill the settlers. They would interrogate them. They would learn the English navigation routes. They would learn the locations of the secret harbors. They would learn the chemistry of the English gunpowder. They would force the settlers to confess the weaknesses of the English. Defenses. A live settler was a dangerous leak. Imagine the meeting between Walsingham and Sir Walter Raleigh. Raleigh is passionate. He wants to save his people. He wants to send ships. But Walsingham is cold. He looks at the map. "We cannot spare the ships, Walter," he says softly. "And even if we could, we cannot risk them leading the Spanish to the colony. Then what becomes of them?" Raleigh asks. Walsingham does not answer immediately. He dips his quill in the ink. "If the Spanish land," Walsingham says, "they must find nothing. No fort, no maps, no Englishmen." This is the birth of the scorched earth theory. Did Walsingham send a fast? Small cutter, a single ship that slipped through the blockade with a final set of orders for the colony. Orders that said, evacuate immediately, dismantle the fort, bury the cannons, dissolve into the woods, become invisible. This explains the orderly dismantling of the houses. It wasn't a panic. It was a military procedure. Protocol Omega. The settlers were not lost. They were following orders. Let us visualize the execution of this order. The ship arrives, not to take them home, but to deliver the command. The captain gathers the settlers. He reads the Queen's warrant. You are to abandon this site. You are to leave no trace that England was ever here. Imagine the heartbreak. They had built these houses with their own hands. They had cleared the fields. This was their home, but they were subjects of the crown. Disobedience was treason. So the work began. They pulled the thatch from the roofs. They pulled the nails from the timber. Iron was too valuable to leave for the Spanish. They took down the palisade walls. Or perhaps they modified them to look like an abandoned native structure. They took the heavy cannons, the falcons and minions, and they dragged them to the edge of the water, or buried them deep in the sand where the metal detectors of the future would struggle to find them. They packed the books, the maps, the scientific instruments. And then they faced the final question: where do we go? The order likely contained a designated safe zone, a place further inland, hidden by swamps where the Spanish galleons could not reach, a place that was not on any map, a place that would remain a secret for 400 years. This theory changes the meaning of the Croatoan carving entirely. It wasn't a message for John White to find them. It was a code word for the safe zone. Walsingham's agents would know what Croatoan meant. It meant operation successful. We have moved to the secondary location. But John White, poor John White, he was out of the loop. He had been in England for 3 years, but he was not part of the inner circle of spies. He arrived, saw the code, and took it literally. He thought it meant the island. He didn't know that Croatoan was the name of the operation, not the destination. Is there proof of this secret order? Is there proof of a secondary location? For centuries, there was nothing. Just rumors. But the paper remembers. In the British Museum, there is a map. It is called the Virginia Pars. It was drawn by John White himself in 1585. It is a beautiful map. It shows the coastline, the islands, the shoals, but for 400 years, researchers noticed something strange about this map. There were 2 patches of paper glued onto the surface. One patch was over the coastline, seemingly to correct a mistake in the drawing. But why glue a patch? Why not just draw a new map? Paper was expensive, yes, but for a royal map, surely they could afford a fresh sheet. Unless the patch wasn't there to correct a mistake, unless it was there to hide a secret. In 2012, researchers at the British Museum used a light table and modern imaging technology to look under the patch. What they found sent a shockwave through the historical community. Under the patch, there was a symbol, a large 4-pointed star, the symbol of a citadel, a fort, and it was located not on Roanoke Island and not on Croatoan Island. It was located 50 miles inland, at the confluence of the Chowan and Roanoke rivers. This was Site X, the Queen's secret fort. This changes everything. It means the colony had a plan B. From the very beginning. It means that when the order came to burn it to the ground, they knew exactly where to go. They went to the fort under the patch, and the reason the patch was glued on to censor the map before John White or Raleigh could show the map to the public, or before it could be risked in travel. The spymaster ordered the location of the secret fort to be covered. "Hide the citadel," Walsingham would have said. If the map is captured, the Spanish must not see the star. So, a piece of paper was pasted over the survivor's destination dot, and over time, the glue hardened. The people who knew the secret died. Walsingham died in 1590. Raleigh was imprisoned and later beheaded. The secret of the patch was forgotten dot, and the settlers were waiting at Site X. Waiting for a rescue that never came, because the only men who knew where they were dead or silenced. This is the tragedy of the secret state. The order was given to save the empire. Not the people got the settlers marched to Site X, they built a new life. They waited for the Queen's ships, but in London the file was closed. Roanoke was written off as a loss. The cover-up was so successful that it fooled the English themselves, die the time the next English. Settlers arrived in Jamestown in 1607-20. Years later, Roanoke was just a legend. The Jamestown settlers heard rumors. They heard stories from the natives about men who dress like you, living in houses built of stone. Far up the river, Captain John Smith, the famous John Smith of Pocahontas, Fame actually tried to find them. He drew a map, the Zuniga map, based on native reports. On this map, he wrote notes about people clothed like us, living at specific locations that match Site X. But he never reached them. Why? Because by 1607, the burn it to the ground order was still in effect psychologically. The Crown wanted a fresh start. They didn't want the baggage of the failed colony. They didn't want to provoke Spain by digging up old conflicts. So the survivors were left to fade away. To marry into the tribes, to break their English china, to melt down their English silver, to forget their English names. They became the ghosts of the Chowan River, but not everyone went quietly. Not everyone accepted the order to disappear. There was one woman who refused to be erased. One woman who wanted the world to know what happened to her family. She didn't have paper. She didn't have a map, but she had a chisel. And she had a stone. She wrote a letter that could not be burned. A letter that would survive the fires of the Queen and the damp of the earth. She wrote the names of the dead, and she signed her name. A name that would haunt American history. Eleanor Dare. We must read the stone for 400 years. The answer to the greatest mystery in American history was not buried in the mud of Roanoke Island. It was not hidden in a Spanish dungeon. It was sitting inside a glass case in London. Staring back at every person who walked past it, we looked at the map 1,000 times. Historians analyzed every line of ink, every curve of the coast, every name of every native village, but they missed the most important detail. They missed the silence. On the famous watercolor map drawn by John White in 1585, there are two small pieces of paper glued onto the surface. For centuries we were told these were corrections. We were told the artist made a mistake and simply pasted over it. We believed it because it was mundane. But in 2012, when scientists finally decided to look under the paper, to look through the layers of time, with X-ray light, they didn't find a mistake. They found a secret. Hidden beneath the patch was a symbol that the British Empire tried to erase. A symbol that proves the lost colony didn't vanish into thin air. They had a destination, and the map didn't get lost. It got censored. This is the truth the king buried. Now. Let the noise of the modern world fall away. Let us step out of the bright sunlight and into the cool, climate-controlled silence of the British Museum. Imagine the smell of old Paper, the scent of dust and history. The sound of your own footsteps echoing on the marble floor. We are walking deep into the archives, past the statues of kings and the tablets of forgotten gods. We are going to the Department of Prints and Drawings. We are going to look at a single sheet of paper. It is fragile. It is yellowed by the passing of 4 centuries, but the colors are still vibrant. The blue of the ocean, the green of the forest, the red of the flags. This is a Virginia. Pars, the map of Virginia. Let us lean in close and examine the ink. To understand the secret, we must understand the hand that drew it. John White was not just a governor, he was an artist. When he first traveled to the New World in 1585, 2 years before the Lost Colony, he brought his paints. He brought his watercolors. His job was to document the invisible world. He sat on the sandy banks of the Outer Banks and painted the truth. He painted the Pamioke village. He painted the dance of the Secondin people. He painted the loggerhead turtles and the swallowtail butterflies. And he painted this map. It is a masterpiece of accuracy. It shows the barrier islands, the long, thin fingers of sand that protect the coast. It shows the dangerous shoals where ships run aground. It shows the entrance to the Albemarle Sound for 400 years. This map has been the primary document for anyone studying Roanoke, but there is a flaw in the perfection. If you look at the map, near the confluence of the Chowan and Roanoke rivers, about 50 miles inland from the coast, there is a blemish, a small, irregular patch of paper that looks like a bandage. It is glued directly onto the surface of the map, covering a specific spot on the riverbank. For generations, curators looked at this patch and shrugged. A correction, they said. White must have drawn a coastline wrong or spilled a drop of ink and used a patch to cover his error. It made sense. Paper was expensive in the Elizabethan era. You didn't throw away a map just because of a smudge. You patched it. So the world ignored the patch. The map hung in galleries. It was photographed for textbooks. It was printed on posters. And all the while the patch sat there, hiding the truth, holding its breath. The year is 2012. The First Colony Foundation, a group of researchers dedicated to finding the truth of Roanoke, is preparing for a new study. They are working with the British Museum. They decide, almost on a whim, to investigate the patches. They do not peel the patch off. That would destroy the artifact. The glue of the 16th century has hardened into stone. Instead, they use light. They place the map on a specialized light table. They use intense backlighting combined with infrared imaging to see through the fibers of the paper. Imagine the room. It is dark. The scientists are gathered around a computer screen. The only light comes from the glow of the monitor. They zoom in on the patch. The light penetrates the top layer of paper. It pushes through the dried glue. It illuminates the ink on the layer underneath, and slowly on the screen, a shape begins to form. It is not a smudge. It is not a mistake. It is not a spilled drop of ink. It is a symbol, a large, four-pointed star. The ink is faint, red and blue, but the shape is unmistakable. In the cartography of the 16th century, a four-pointed star meant only one thing. It didn't mean a village. It didn't mean a mountain. It meant a fort, a citadel. And this was not just a sketch. It was a finished symbol. John White had drawn a large, fortified structure 50 miles inland at the precise point where the rivers met. A strategic location. A place where a ship could sail upriver, unload supplies, and be safe from the Spanish. Galleons patrolling the coast. The scientists gasped. They looked at the second patch, a smaller one further down the coast. Under that patch they found another mark. A line, a route. The map wasn't corrected. It was redacted. Why hide a fort? If John White drew it, why did he cover it up? This brings us back to the secret order. Imagine the moment. John White finishes his map. He draws the city of Raleigh on the coast, but he also draws the citadel inland, the fallback position. The secret base. He presents the map to Sir Walter Raleigh and Sir Francis Walsingham. Walsingham looks at the map. He sees the star. This map, the spymaster says, will be copied. It will be seen by investors. It might be stolen by Spanish spies. He points to the star. If the Spanish see this star, they will know exactly where our fallback position is. They will sail up the river and burn it. Cover it, he orders. So John White takes a scrap of paper. He cuts it to the shape of the riverbank. He paints over it to make it look like empty land. And he glues it over the star. He hides the citadel. He creates a clean version of the map for public consumption. But he leaves the star underneath. Perhaps he hoped that one day he could peel the patch off. Perhaps he hoped he could give the true map to a rescue captain, but he never got the chance. The map remained patched. The secret remained glued shut, and the settlers? The settlers knew about the star. They didn't need the map. They had the plan. When the order came to burn it to the ground, as we discussed in the last chapter, they knew where to go. Go to the star, the order would have said. Go to the place on the river. So they packed their bags. They dismantled their houses. They left the decoy message, Croatoan, on the tree to confuse the Spanish, and they marched 50 miles inland, to the exact spot hidden under the patch. So, what is at that spot today? We call it Site X. It is located in Bertie County, North Carolina. Near the Salmon Creek area. After the British Museum discovery, archaeologists rushed to the site. They didn't find a stone castle standing there. 400 years of floods and farming have wiped away the surface, but they started digging. And in the soil, they found ghosts. They found English pottery, border ware, North Devon gravel-tempered ware, pottery that dates exactly to the 1580s. They found a primping hookah, small tool used by Elizabethan gentlemen to adjust their clothes. They found an aglet, the metal tip of a shoelace. These are not items that Native Americans used. These are items that belong to English families. They found them in the exact spot where the star was hidden on the map. This is the smoking gun. It proves that at least some of the settlers made it to Site X. They survived the coast. They survived the drought. They made it to the safe house. They lived there. They cooked in those pots. They laced their shoes with those aglaes. They were alive, but They didn't stay. The archaeology shows a small occupation. A few years perhaps, and then silence again. Why did they leave the safe house? Did the Spanish find them even there? Did the wood sickness follow them inland? Or did they realize that the fort was too small, the land too poor? Did they realize that no ship was coming for them? The patch on the map hid where they went, but it doesn't tell us where they ended up. For that, we need a different kind of record, a record written by a mother who was watching her family die. The map is made of paper. Paper is the tool of empires. It is the tool of spies and kings. It can be altered. It can be patched. It can be lied to, but stone is the tool of the desperate when the paper runs out, when the ink dries up, when the hope of rescue fades into the dark woods. You turn to the earth. Eleanor Dare, the mother of the first English child, carried the weight of the colony on her shoulders. She saw the fort at Site X fail. She saw the people fracture. And as they moved further into the darkness, away from the star on the map, she stopped trusting the queen. She stopped trusting the paper. She picked up a rock, a heavy QURTZ stone, and she began to carve a message that no spy master could patch over, a message that would be found in a swamp. Nearly 350 years later, a message that lists the names of the dead. The stone tells no lies. Next, we must read the writing in the rock. We often think of archaeology as digging in the dirt. But the most important excavation of the 21st century didn't happen in the ground. It happened inside a beam of light. For centuries, the British Empire held a secret right in front of our faces. The map of the New World, drawn by the hand of the lost governor himself, contained a deliberate act of censorship, a paper patch glued over the surface, hiding a location that the crown did not want the world to see. We were told it was a mistake. We were told it was a correction. But when scientists finally turned the eye of God, modern X-ray spectroscopy, onto that fragile paper, the lie disintegrated. The patch wasn't hiding a smudge. It was hiding a fortress. Underneath the glue, invisible to the naked eye but burning bright under the X-ray, was a symbol drawn in red and blue ink. A massive, four-pointed citadel located 50 miles inland. This was not a map of where they were. It was a map of where they were ordered to go. The settlers didn't vanish into the chaos of the wild. They marched to a classified black site. And we only know this because a machine learned how to see through 400 years of silence. This is the truth the king buried. Now. Let the dust of the archives settle. We are stepping out of the candlelight of the 16th century and into the sterile, humming silence of a modern laboratory. Imagine a room bathed in soft blue light. The air is filtered. The temperature is controlled to the degree. In the center of the room, lying on a black table, is the map. La Virginia Pars. It looks small. It looks vulnerable. A piece of paper that has survived storms, ships, and wars. Hovering above it is a machine, a scanner. It does not touch the paper. It simply looks. It looks with eyes that can see the chemical signature of ink. Let us stand beside the scientists as they prepare to peel back the layers of history. Without lifting a finger. To understand what happened next, we must understand the ink. In 1585, John White made his paints from the earth. He ground up lapis lazuli for blue. He used vermilion for red. He used gallnuts and iron for black. These are not just colors. They are chemicals. They are heavy metals and organic compounds, and even when they are covered by another piece of paper and sealed with 400-year-old glue, they still have a magnetic soul. The scientists at the British Museum used a technique called Raman spectroscopy. It sounds complex, but the concept is poetic. They shine a laser onto the map. The light goes through the patch. It hits the ink hidden underneath. And the ink vibrates. The copper in the blue paint vibrates differently than the iron in the black ink. The machine listens to these vibrations. It maps them. It is like hearing a whisper through a stone wall on the computer screen. Pixels began to light up. At first, it was just noise, static. Then the lines began to connect. The scientists watched as the invisible became visible. The shape under the patch was not random. It was geometric. It was intentional. It was a large square with diamond-shaped bastions at the corners. The room fell silent. Every historian knows what that shape means. It is the universal symbol for a fortified city, a citadel, and it was huge. On the scale of the map, it represented a structure capable of holding hundreds of people. John White hadn't just drawn a campsite. He had drawn a capital dot. Why is this symbol so shocking? Because in all the official reports, in all the letters sent to the Queen, in all the journals of the voyage, this fort is never mentioned. The official story was, we are going to Roanoke Island. If that fails, we will go to the Chesapeake Bay. There was never a mention of an inland fort at the head of the Albemarle Sound. This means the fort was a black project. It was a secret contingency plan, known only to the leadership. Think of the logic. If you are planting a colony in enemy territory, remember the Spanish threat we discussed, you do not put all your eggs in one basket. You build a decoy on the coast, Roanoke, but you prepare a stronghold in the interior. The X-ray revealed that John White knew about this stronghold. He drew it, he marked the route to it, but then he covered it. Why? The theory of security clearance is the most likely. Sir Francis Walsingham, the spymaster, likely saw the map and said, "This is too dangerous. If this map falls into Spanish hands, they will march straight to our sanctuary." So the patch was applied, not to fix a mistake, but to encrypt the map. The patch turned the map from a military document into a generic landscape. It was an act of counterintelligence, but for the settlers left behind, the patch didn't matter. They knew the plan, Protocol Citadel. When the supplies didn't come, when the drought turned the land to dust, when the Spanish ships appeared on the horizon, they didn't panic. They didn't wander aimlessly into the woods. They executed the plan. They packed their bags. They abandoned the decoy site. And they moved to the location marked by the invisible star. We call this location Site X. And thanks to the X-ray, we finally knew where to dig. A map is just a piece of paper until you put a shovel in the ground. The X-ray gave the coordinates. The site was located in Bertie County, North Carolina, near a place called Salmon Creek. It is a quiet place today. Tall trees, green fields, the water of the Albemarle Sound lapping against the muddy banks. In 2013, the first colony foundation arrived. They were armed with the map, coordinates, and metal detectors. They didn't expect to find a standing fortress. 400 years of floods, hurricanes, and farming would have erased any wooden walls. They were looking for trash. Because trash tells the truth. If 100 English people lived here for a year or two, they would have broken things. They would have lost things. The archaeologists started digging. They peeled back the topsoil, the modern layer. They went down past the 19th century farm layer, past the 18th century colonial layer. They reached the contact layer, the soil of the late 1500s, and the metal detectors began to sing beep beep What they pulled out of the mud was not gold. It was not silver. To an untrained eye, it looked like junk. But to an archaeologist, it was more precious than diamonds. Let us examine the 3 artifacts that broke the silence. Artifact number 1, the border where they found sherds of broken pottery. Small, glazed pieces of ceramic. This wasn't just any pottery. This was Surrey, Hampshire borderware. Why is that specific name important? Because we know exactly when this pottery was made, and we know exactly when it stopped being shipped to America. It was the Tupperware of the 1580s, cheap, durable, everyday kitchenware used by English families. Crucially, the Virginia Company, the group that founded Jamestown in 1607, did not use this type of borderware by 1607. The style had changed. Finding this specific pottery at Site X is like finding a specific model of iPhone in a landfill. It dates the site perfectly to the Roanoke era. It proves that English people were cooking dinner here in the late 1580s. Artifact number 2, the priming flask. They found a small metal hook, corroded, green with age. It was part of a bandolier soldier's belt. Specifically, it was the hook used to hold a priming flask, a small container of gunpowder used to fire a musket. Native Americans did not have muskets in the 1580s. This object proves that they were armed. Englishmen at Site X, soldiers or settlers prepared to defend themselves. Artifact number 3, the GLE. This is the most intimate of all. An aglet is the small metal tip at the end of a lace, like the plastic tip on your shoelaces today. In Elizabethan England, they used laces to tie their doublets, their corsets, their breeches. They found a copper aglet in the dirt. Think about what this means. This isn't a trade good. You don't trade a single shoelace tip to a Native American. An aglet falls off when you are getting dressed in the morning. When you are rushing to put on your clothes. It is a sign of domestic life. It is a sign of women, of men, of families living, dressing, and undressing on the banks of Salmon Creek. It proves they didn't just pass through. They lived here. So the X-ray was right. The star was real. The survivors of Roanoke, or at least a large group of them, made it to the safe house. They escaped the coast. They escaped the Spanish detection. They paddled up the Albemarle Sound, 50 miles inland, and set up a new colony at Site X. Imagine the relief. Here, the water was fresh. The rivers flow from the mountains, bypassing the drought. Here, they were hidden by the deep forests. Here, they had their pottery, their guns, their clothes. They were waiting. They likely built a palisade. They planted crops. They set a watch. They looked at the map John White had left them, or the copy they had. They pointed to the star. He knows we are here, they would have said. He drew this spot. He will come for us here. They waited in 1588. They waited in 1589. They waited in 1590. But John White never came to Site X. Remember the tragedy of his return? He saw the Croatoan sign on the coast. He assumed they were on the island. But the storm broke his anchor, and he was forced to leave. He never looked inland. He never sailed up the river to the star. He was 50 miles away from saving them. So close. And yet, an ocean away. And this leads to the final mystery of Site X. The archaeology shows a low density of artifacts. This means they didn't stay there forever. They stayed for a few years, and then they moved again. Why? Did the local tribes push them out? Did the wood sickness eventually find them? Or did they realize after 3 years of silence that England had forgotten them? Site X was a waiting room, and when the waiting ended, the desperation began. They had to move. But where? They couldn't go back to the coast. So they went deeper. Deeper into the American interior, into the lands of the powerful kings of the South. And as they left Site X, they left behind their English pottery. They left behind their heavy clothes. They began to shed their identity. But one woman refused to be forgotten. She carried a stone, a heavy quartz stone, and as they marched away from the safety of the star and into the unknown dark, she began to carve. The map ends here. The paper trail is cold. We have spent 400 years digging for bones. We have spent 400 years looking for a mass grave that does not exist. We have been asking the wrong question. We asked, how did they die? When we should have been asking, who did they become? The lost colony of Roanoke is not lost. It never was. The descendants of the 115 settlers are walking among us right now. They are living in the swamps of North Carolina. They have been there for centuries, hidden in plain sight. When the first European explorers returned to the Carolina interior 50 years after the disappearance, they didn't find an empty wilderness. They found a tribe of Native Americans who lived in stone houses. They found a tribe who tilled the earth with English plows. And most terrifying of all, they found a tribe with eyes as blue as the Atlantic Ocean and hair as gold as wheat. They called them the Lumbee. And for centuries, history tried to erase them, to categorize them, to deny them. But you cannot erase biology. Modern DNA testing has finally unlocked the code of the bloodline. The genetic markers of the Roanoke settlers didn't vanish into the dirt. They flowed into the veins of the people who saved them. The mystery isn't a ghost story. It's a family tree. This is the truth the king buried. Now. Let the science settle. Let us walk away from the cold laboratories and the dusty museums. We are going to travel down the old dirt roads of Robeson County, North Carolina. The air here is thick and sweet, smelling of tobacco and damp earth. The crickets are singing in the tall grass. We are going to a place where history is not written in books, but in the faces of the people. Imagine sitting on a wooden porch as the sun goes down. The shadows lengthen, and an old man begins to tell you a story about his grandfather's grandfather. A story about the old ones who came from the sea. Let us listen to the blood. To understand the DNA. We must first understand the visual shock of the 17th century. It is the year 1650. The English have finally returned to the Carolinas in force. They are moving inland, away from the coast, exploring the swamps of the Lumber River. They expect to find hostile tribes. They expect to find the wilderness. Instead, they stumble upon a settlement that defies logic. The people here do not dress in simple deerskins. They wear woven clothes that mimic the fashion of Elizabethan England, but modified, adapted to the woods. They do not live in wigwams. They live in cabins. Cabins with chimneys. Cabins built with the same notches and joints used by English carpenters. But it is the faces that stop the explorers in their tracks. Among the dark eyes and bronze skin of the native people, there are anomalies: a young woman with eyes the color of sea glass, a man with a beard. Something Native American men genetically do not grow thick and red. Children with freckles scattered across their noses like constellations. The explorers are confused. They ask the elders, "Who are you?" And the elders reply in a language that sounds strange, yet familiar. It is not Algonquin. It is not Iroquoian. It is English, but it is an Old English. A frozen English. They use words like hit instead of it. They use mamuk for mess. They speak with the lilt of the West Country, the dialect of Devon and Cornwall, the dialect of Sir Walter Raleigh, the explorers wrote. Back to the colonies. We have found a people who claim their ancestors talked in a book. They say their fathers came from the Great Water. This was the first proof. The survivors of Roanoke had not been slaughtered. They had been adopted, but looks can be deceiving. Eye color can be a mutation. A beard can be a fluke. To be certain, we need more than faces. We need names. When John White left the colony in 1587, he had a manifest. A list of every man, woman, and child he left behind. 117 names. For centuries, this list was just a memorial, but then Historians began to look at the census records of the Lumbee tribe from the 1700s and 1800s. They took the lost list of Roanoke, and they compared it to the found list of the Lumbee. The results are statistically impossible to be a coincidence. Out of the 95 surnames on the Roanoke Manifest, 41 of them are found in the earliest records. Of the Lumbee tribe, let us hear the names: Sampson, Cooper, Dare, Stevens, Vickers, White, Harris, Berry. These are not common names like Smith or Jones. These are specific family names from the 16th century. Imagine the odds. How does a tribe isolated in the swamps of North Carolina, hundreds of miles from the nearest English city, possess the exact same last names as the Lost Colony? There's only one answer. The people who carried those names didn't die. They walked into the woods. They met the Croatoan and the Secondon people, and instead of fighting, they made a deal. We have weapons, the settlers might have said. We have tools. We have knowledge of the enemy. And the tribes might have said, we have food. We have water. We have protection. So they merged. The settlers dropped their heavy Elizabethan titles. They stopped being Mr. Ananias Dare, gentlemen. They became simply Dare. They married. They had children. And within 2 generations, the English colony was gone. But the Lumbee tribe was born. For a long time, this was just a theory. The oral tradition, they called it. But in the 21st century, we don't need to rely on stories. We have the double helix, commercial DNA testing companies like 23andMe, and Familitridna opened a window into the past that no historian could look through. Thousands of people in North Carolina, people who identify as Lumbee, began to test their blood. They expected to see a mix of Native American and perhaps some modern European DNA, but the results showed something specific. They showed a high percentage of Western European admixture. Specifically, markers from the British Isles. But here is the key. The markers date back too far. If the admixture happened in the 1800s or 1900s, the DNA strands would look different. They would be longer, less broken up by recombination, but the European DNA in the Lumbee population is deeply integrated. It is old admixture. It dates back to the 1600s, to a time when there were no other white settlers in that part of North Carolina. There was no Jamestown yet. There was no Plymouth Rock yet. The only Europeans in North America. Who could have contributed that DNA to that specific region? Were the people of Roanoke? The science tells us that the white blood didn't come from conquest. It didn't come from slavery. It came from integration. It came from a moment of desperate survival, where 2 races became one. Let us go back to the eyes. The gray eyes of the Lumbee are legendary in the South. Genetics is a game of probability. Brown eyes are dominant. Blue and gray eyes are recessive. For a population of Native Americans to sustain blue or gray eyes for 400 years, the initial introduction of that gene must have been significant. It wasn't just one stray sailor washing ashore. It suggests that a large group of light-eyed people entered the gene pool at the same time. 80 people, the number of survivors we estimated from the Dare Stone. 80 people entering a tribe of perhaps a few hundred would be a massive genetic event. It would be enough to change the phenotype, the physical look of the tribe forever. It explains why the Lumbee were treated so differently by history. In the 1830s, when the U.S. government was forcing Native Americans onto the Trail of Tears, pushing them west. The Lumbee were often left alone. Why? because they didn't look Indian enough to the soldiers. They had stone houses. They farmed. They had English names. They had gray eyes. The racism of the time actually saved them. The government didn't know what to do with them. They were a paradox. They were the Croatoan enigma living in the 19th century. But if they survived, why didn't they call out? Why didn't they send a runner to Jamestown? Why didn't they flag down a ship? This is the question that haunts us. But consider the trauma. We discussed in the earlier chapters they had been abandoned by the Queen. They had been hunted by the Spanish. They had been ravaged by disease. They had seen their friends die in the wood sickness. Perhaps they didn't want to be found. By the time the English returned to the area, the survivors had been living with the tribes for 20 or 30 years. Virginia Dare would have been a grown woman. She would have grown up speaking the Algonquin language. She would have a husband from the tribe. She would have children who were half-native. To go back to England would mean tearing her family apart. It would mean being paraded as a curiosity in London. It would mean subjecting her mixed-race children to the scorn of the British court. She could stay in the swamp where she was safe, where she was respected, where she was free from the politics of kings and spy masters. Maybe the silence wasn't an accident. Maybe it was a choice, the ultimate act of rebellion against the empire that left them to die was to stop being. English. To take the name Dare and turn it into a Lumbee. Name. To take the gray eyes of the British Isles and turn them into the eyes of the forest. So the Lost Colony is not a mystery to be solved. It is a neighbor to be met. If you drive through Robeson County today, look at the names on the mailboxes. Look at the faces in the supermarket. You are looking at the ghosts of 1587. They didn't vanish. They just changed. And in their veins, the blood of the explorers and the blood of the ancients flows together. A living monument to the fact that survival sometimes means letting go of who you were. To become who you need to be, the map had a patch. The stone had a message. But the blood has the truth. And now we have one final question to answer. If they survived, and if the government knew, why was the lost myth maintained for so long? Why did we need them to be lost? This brings us to our final chapter. The colony that was never meant to be found. We end our journey with the most disturbing question of all. Not, where did they go? But why did we want them to be lost? For 400 years, the British Empire and later the American government insisted that Roanoke was a mystery. They insisted the settlers vanished into thin air. But we now know about the map with the patch. We know about the Dare Stone. We know about the DNA in the Lumbee tribe. The evidence was always there. So why was it ignored? Because a lost colony is a tragedy, but a mixed colony is a political threat if the settlers survive. If they married into the tribes, if they created a new mixed race, then the land wasn't terra nullius. It wasn't empty land for the taking. It was occupied by English subjects who had rejected the crown to live with the savages. To admit they survived would be to admit that the empire had failed. To admit they survived would be to validate the Native American claim to the land. And so a narrative was constructed. The government didn't lose the colony. They chose to lose it. They needed ghosts because ghosts don't have land rights. Ghosts don't pay taxes. And ghosts don't rebel. This is the truth the king buried. Now. Let us close the archives. Let us blow out the candle that has guided us through the dark corridors of the 16th century. The smoke rises, curling into the darkness, carrying with it the names, the dates, and the fears of the past. The library is quiet now. The storm has passed. We are left only with the night, and the stars that look down on the same earth, the same rivers, and the same trees that watched the settlers 4 centuries ago. Let us drift into the final reflection. Let us understand the meaning of the silence. Why do we love a mystery? Why do we prefer the idea of a lost colony over the reality of a found family? Perhaps it is because mystery is safe. A mystery allows us to dream. It allows us to imagine supernatural forces or tragic romances or heroic last stands. But the reality of Roanoke, the reality we have uncovered tonight, is messy. It is human. It is a story of dehydration, of political betrayal, of desperate mothers carving stones in the swamp, of people shedding their clothes and their culture just to survive one more winter. The British Empire needed a clean slate when King James came to the throne. After Queen Elizabeth, he wanted to build a new colony, Jamestown. He needed investors. He needed money. He couldn't sell the idea of America if the investors thought, wait, didn't the last group get eaten? Or didn't the last group run off to live with the natives? Neither option was good for business. So the lost narrative was useful. It turned the settlers into martyrs. They didn't defect, the story went. They were victims of the wilderness. We must go back to avenge them. We must go back to tame the land. The myth of the disappearance became the fuel for the conquest. It erased the uncomfortable truth that English people and native people could live together, that they could become one people if Roanoke had succeeded, if the Lumbee integration had been acknowledged and celebrated. American history might have looked very different. It might have been a history of cooperation, not war, but that was not the history the king wanted. So the patch remained on the map. The stone remained in the mud, and the people were forgotten, but truth has a way of rising. Like water in a well, the names did not disappear. They echoed in the deep woods of the Carolinas, Dare, White, Cooper, Harvey, Cage. They were spoken around campfires for generations, not as the names of dead ancestors, but as the names of living grandfathers and grandmothers. The settlers achieved something that Sir Walter Raleigh never could. Raleigh wanted to build an empire of walls and forts. He failed. The walls rotted. The forts fell down. The settlers built an empire of blood. They wove themselves into the fabric of the land. They became the land. And in doing so, they achieved immortality. They are not lost. Every time a child in Robeson County is born with gray eyes, Ananias Dare lives again. Every time a farmer in the Carolinas turns up a piece of Elizabethan pottery with his plow, the city of Raleigh rises from the dust. They are not ghosts haunting the woods. They are the woods. Now. Let us take one last walk together. Let us walk back to the tree where it all began. The sun has set. The moon is high and full, casting a silver path across the Atlantic Ocean. The waves are gentle now. Hush. 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 The dunes. The sand is cool beneath our feet. We walk into the forest of live oaks. The branches form a cathedral above us, blocking out the sky. We see the tree. The bark is rough and ancient. We trace the letters with our mind. C, R, O, Etoan. It is no longer a scary word. It is no longer a warning. It is signpost home. It means we are safe. We have gone to the place where we belong. Do not worry about us. We leave the tree. We float upwards above the canopy. We see the map of the coast spread out below us. The barrier islands looking like a thin gold chain. The dark rivers winding inland like veins. We see Site X hiding its secrets in the soil. We see the stones sleeping in the swamp. We see the homes of the people who carry the blood. All of it is at peace. The struggle is over. The starvation is over. The fear of the Spanish sails is over. There is only the quiet hum of history. The king buried the truth. But the earth kept it safe. And now? You are the keeper of the secret. You know that the lost colony was never lost. It was just waiting for you to find it. And now that it is found, it can rest, and you can rest. The mystery is solved. The book is closed. The archives are locked. There is nothing left to search for. There is nothing left to fear. The ships are in the harbor. The sails are furled. The sea is calm. Let the darkness wrap around you like a warm blanket. Let the sound of the ocean carry you away, drifting back, past the stones, past the maps, past the years, into the deep, silent, peaceful slumber of history. Sleep now. The story is done. Good night.